come to Ritual 4, and we're following our method, which is to take pairs of books and juxtapose them in such a way that they make a set. And these sets are arbitrary. They're arbitrary initially, but they serve to illuminate an inquiry which styles learning. An education is always a structure, a learning is always a process of inquiry, and we're focusing on the process of learning. We've been using Gladys Reichard's Navajo Medicine Man sand paintings, originally done in 1937, a limited edition, and the World's Classics translation of the Analects of Confucius, the Lun Yu of Confucius. And we're finishing with them today. We've been with them for 4 weeks, and the next set of 4 presentations are going to be a new pair, 2 women, Ruth Benedict, her classic Patterns of Culture, came out in the 1930s as well, and Jessie L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance, that originally was published by Cambridge in 1920. Both books revolutionized educational approaches to man. Jessie L. Weston's book was immediately influential because it was the whole background for T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land and all kinds of developments that came in the 1920s and 30s. Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture established a new kind of anthropology, and there are many editions of them. Dover is reprinted From Ritual to Romance, and it's available now, reprinted in 1997, because there's nothing to go out of date in it. And Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture has been in maybe 30 editions, and you can find them used on the internet quite easily. And we're going to have them as the middle set, the middle pair of books for our ritual phase. And our learning is phase-formed rather than subject-based. It goes by phases that syncopate. They have an alternation. There are 2 kinds of phases. One of them is a phase of form, and the other is a phase of process. And we start with the process, and the first process is nature. And the first form, we call in this learning, we call it ritual, because it is ritual objectivity that is the first form in the universe. It is better known as existence. And one of the established formal certainties that we have is that existence, existential forms, do not require reference from themselves, but rather the traditional way to speak of them is that they are. They have isness. And as we have seen, because of the way in which nature has a process of energy, an energy which has 2 braided qualities to it. Energy which continues, which is a dynamic, and the Greek term for that was dynamis, out of which we get the word dynamic. And it is a characteristic of the universe. For instance, the energy of heat, thermodynamics, is universal. And there are several different varieties of dynamic energy. But the Greeks had another word for energy that was related to dynamis, but a little bit different in emphasis. We get our term energy from the Greek. The Greek term was energeia. So that when you look back to classical Greece, you find contemporaneous two individuals who each take a kind of energy to try to develop a theory of man on the basis of it. The classical Greek who used dynamis was Thucydides, and he turned it into history. And the classical Greek who used energeia was Plato, and he turned it into philosophy. And they were contemporaneous. So that philosophy and history in classical Greece are two presentations in symbolic form and in high consciousness of a natural universal occurrence, that nature, before form is established, occurs in energy. And that means that energy has always a frequency. It has a calibration. And one of the aspects is that a dynamic does not register its calibration in sequence, but in a flow, so that a dynamic is a continuous. It's always occurring. And from this, one would get the sense in language of verbs, that the verbal language expression is that of dynamic, of continuing activity, and so verbs have a deep natural quality to it. The other, energy, energeia, tends to like to collect at discrete levels, discrete frequencies, and when it does, it manifests as a form, as particles, as quarks, as protons, as electrons, as neutrons, as atoms, as genes, as cells, as things, so that all matter forms, are calibrations of energy at discrete, specific, and exact quantities. The electron is 511 megavolts, and it's that way everywhere in the universe. What we're looking at is that in nature, in the process, energeia and dynamis are together. And because they're together, there's no separation of process and form, so that nature has a peculiar quality to it. It is both empty and full at the same time, in the sense that it does not have anything smaller than itself, nor is there anything larger than itself. So that one of the ways in which our learning began was with the I Ching and with Thoreau, a pair of books, a selection of Thoreau's writings as the portable Thoreau and the I Ching, and that was our initial pair of books. And what we saw that was characteristic of nature, and thus our learning had a traction not on a presupposition of structure and form yet, but just participating in the actuality of what nature is, and energy and dynamic, energy and dynamis, energy and dynamic, when they're undifferentiated, have a quality of both zero and infinity at the very same time. And we saw that the Chinese word for that zero infinity was Tao. And one of the protean qualities of nature is that when it begins to register energy and dynamis together, it occurs as a time. And that time is the first dimension. And as time begins to generate energy and dynamic together, space blossoms out of time naturally. And we're used to, by the early 21st century, of understanding that due to Einstein especially. We understand space-time to be a continuum. It's more proper to speak of it as time-space because time is not the fourth dimension but the first. So the three dimensions of space blossoming out of time blossom out again and again and again, and the classic word for that is iteration. Each iteration is an emergence into form out of formlessness, out of Tao, out of not formlessness as no form, but out of zero infinity. It isn't a 0 point. It isn't an infiniteness. It's just zero in infinity continuously. And so existentiality, form, is a calibration of energy within dynamic. And as it calibrates within dynamic, time, space begins to polarize, and in its polarity, it begins to have traction to make structure that will hold and be stable. But all structures, in their stability, are eventually, ultimately, time-bound. They are bound by time. That is to say, they have a certain lifetime, and that lifetime has its emergence into the form, and the form goes through its various developments and reaches a maturity, a fullness, and then begins a decline, and then has a cease. It is a birth, a development to a certain extent, an apex, a decline, and a death, if we can call it that. But that's an anthropomorphic projection. It's just that life forms, or even inorganic forms, have a lifetime. In this universe, we have come to understand that one of the forms that's longest lived is the proton. And the proton will last for hundreds of billions of years, stable on that time scale. But there will eventually, before infinity, come some moment where the protons of the universe will have served out their time-boundness, and they will be reabsorbed again into the Tao. We don't need to worry about this at all. What has occurred for us is that our learning showed us that there are various kinds of processes then that are steps up in the energy of occurrence, in the action of both their energy increasing in its complexity, and that the dynamic gains more amperage, more oomph. And while nature, as the first process, the second process, it has much more energy to it. It has a much more of a structure to it. And the next process we will see when we finish with ritual, we'll go to the third phase of our learning. And the third phase is all about experience. And experience, the best way to characterize it is as myth. Not that it's myth or mythic in the sense that it is something wishy-washy or not true or false. But the mythic horizon is one where language comes into play. It's one where feeling comes into play as images and as tone. And feeling-toned images that are languaged are capable of generating experience. And experience is largely the realm in which we live. We live in experience. We have discovered that it's very good to have experience parallel with nature as best it can be, so that we return to nature so that our experience jibes with nature, so that the two processes flow together. When two phases that are separated by an intermediate phase, are in parallel, they tend to do what our pairs of texts do. They tend to set up a set, a resonant set, so that in between them, whatever phase is in between them, and this is the advantage of our learning, of our education, that we're able to disclose to ourselves the way in which things are. It's better to say it in that phrase rather than to say what is true. The phrase, the way things are, goes back to about 50 BC to a great physicist at the time, the greatest of all the Roman physicists, Lucretius. De rerum natura translates not so much as the way of nature, but the way things are, is a very good translation of that. When you have nature and experience that are put into a set together and have a consonance, so that our life in experience is consonant with the way in which nature works, then what is in between there, ritual forms, will have their own calibration, a calibration deeper than truth, a calibration that traditionally was called thusness. In Sanskrit, the word is tathata. Or sometimes it's translated as suchness, but the classic way in which Greek wisdom used it is in Parmenides, a pre-Socratic philosopher, very much almost like the image of an Asian wise man. Long white hair, he looked like a William Blake figure. And he wrote a mystical long poem called The Way of Parmenides. And in it, the key is the set, the pair, where he said what is, and what isn't, isn't. That isness does not include within itself anything not. So that pure isness really has a quality of wholeness in the sense that it is a unified one. And because the ones can add up to something larger, or you can subtract ones from something larger and come down smaller, that the discrete thusness of all things is able to be calibrated. One can know exactly what something is. So that the isness is not there because of a projection of the mind or because of assumptions of a religion, but existentials are quite real in and of themselves. But the proviso all the time is that they are not statically there, but they are iteratively there. One of the great triumphs of the end of the 20th century was string theory, that the ultimate form is even below quarks, and they are superstrings, which vibrate, meaning that they iterate so many billions of times per microsecond that they seem to always be there. It's like if you look at a film and you see so many frames per second, it seems continuous, and yet one can see that it really is a multiplicity of frames played so fast that it seems that it is continuous. The same thing for all forms in the universe. They are discrete in their iteration, and their energy frequency is the numerical value that's there in that energy, and therein thus the form. Whereas a dynamic has a zero quality all the time, an infinite quality all the time, always occurs. So that the learning that we're getting ourselves used to is that the dynamic and the energy are always together in reality, And it behooves us to pay attention to this, because when we're building forms that are stable, we want to keep them open to the flow of the dynamic so that they are not closed off. It's like the idea of an architecture that is open to its landscape and invites the interplay of inner and outer to form a continuity, which then is a living space. And one's living space is out into the garden or the landscape as well as into the building. And one is able to not just flow into a structure, but to experience nature in the structure and to experience that structure's architecture out in nature. One of the most extraordinary examples of this, I once spent a whole day with a camera and several cameras at the Gamble House in Pasadena, built by Green & Green in 1902, one of the really great houses of the world. And Green & Green, they took the Gamble family. They were the heirs of the Procter & Gamble soap fortune. And the Green & Green, the two brothers, said to them, why don't you go to Europe for a year, and when you come back, your house will be ready. And they got them out of their hair, and they spent, at the time in 1902, the unheard of sum of $50,000 building the Gamble House. Almost bankrupted this wealthy family. But they used a universal energy structure put into a symbolic mode, but before it was put into the symbolic mode, they let it weave throughout the entire structure. They used the structure of clouds. And they took the Japanese symbol for cloud, which is a line that has like a little bubble in it, and then the line continues. It's like a flattened Greek omega. And everywhere in the structure you will find these Japanese cloud symbols, but it's not that the symbols control the house, it's that the space of the house and the garden are expressive of cloudness. So that after a while, after about 8 hours there of filming and intense participation with the house, folding up all the cameras, I went out and I felt that my feet were kinesthetically scuffing clouds, that the house had gotten to me, and that even when I was out in the garden, I realized, well, the garden and the house they're the same vibration. They have the same resonance. They have the same frequency. Another example, I spent one time, a long time, studying the Japanese Prince of Hiroshige. This was in Berkeley, California. And after a couple of months of training myself to see Hiroshige-like, I was astounded one day. My apartment was on College Avenue across from the Presbyterian Church by Derby College, and the full moon rose over this beautiful Bernard Maybeck church with its withered yellow grass and its pine trees, and it looked exactly like a Hiroshige print. I learned that you see not just in that style or in that symbol, but you see because you are richly calibrated to participate in that nature and in that experience seamlessly together. That nature and experience are together, and therefore the ritual comportment is exact. One not only sees and hears and tastes and kinesthetically feels what is naturally occurring, but one also has in one's experience that occurrence is seamless, so that one's feeling tones, one's images, the saying is that they are pure. not meaning that they're pure because they're weeded out of all evil or all error. They are pure because they occur in every iteration immediately, spontaneously, as it is. So that there is a possibility of having the process of nature and the process of experience not aligned referentially, but brought into a resonant set where they exchange with each other without any kind of a break, without any kind of a separation, because the ritual forms, instead of being walls, are open. They're formal, but they're like open frames, and one can go back and forth on either side. This is, of course, Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. It's no longer a mirror that stops you. It's a mirror that allows you to go into Wonderland and to come back out of Wonderland into nature again. One of the curious things is that the development of very large telescopes was due to the fact that a process of being able to silver the glass on very large levels so that the starlight collected in the mirror would be pristinely exactly what it is and not distorted by anything else. And so the giant telescopes with their silvered mirrors became more and more attuned to being open frames until we found in the late 1960s, early 1970s, that there was a distortion going on just the same that one noticed if one starlight was billions of years away. And so what was developed out of that was a different form of mirror with adaptive optics. And instead of using photographic plates, one used charged coupled devices, paired energy registries, CCDs. And now, with a 10-meter telescope like the Keck's in Hawaii with CCDs and adaptive optics, one can see quite easily back to about 13 billion light years, pristinely. Well enough to see that a recent astronomical photo published in Nature, the International Journal of Science, a couple of weeks ago, that about 6.5 billion light years away, there is a cluster of galaxies that are so far away that we can hardly distinguish them, and yet they are so powerful because there are so many of them, and their gravity is so intense that they bend the light of a quasar, which is in direct line with them and us, that's about 13 billion light years away. So that the light of that quasar is split into 4. And the 4 registries on a CCD plate are exactly the same, and we know now that that quasar, 13 billion light years away, that space-time itself is a registry of energy form. It has a definite form. It isn't just mystically not there. It isn't just vacuum. But that time-space itself has an existential, iterative formalness. And that gravity bends light waves. And so we have a thing called gravity lensing. The latest satellite that was put up is going to test the way in which the Earth, going around our star, drags the frame of time-space. And frame dragging of space by this summer will be confirmed. Einstein predicted it back in the 1930s. So that all existentials, including time-space itself, are formal in the sense that they are exact calibrations of energy, which allows for the action of those existentials to occur stably on the level that we live in, but to occur iteratively on a different calibration of an energy scale. And the energy scale that we live on is the electromagnetic energy scale. The other calibration is the other way around. Instead of electromagnetic, magnetoelectric. James Clerk Maxwell's great equations of electromagnetic energy, when they were published in 1879, changed the whole nature of the way that nature is looked at. But Maxwell was a good Victorian Scotsman, and he refused to countenance that his equations solved two different ways. They solved positively as electromagnetism, but they also solved negatively, seemingly, as magnetoelectric. And it was inconceivable, even to the genius of Maxwell, even to the genius of Einstein. It was inconceivable that one could have this negative calibration of magnetoelectric because the energy scale goes way off the chart. Iteration in a magnetoelectric continuum is about 10 billion times the energy of the electromagnetic spectrum. So that if one were a being in a magnetoelectric universe, you could walk through this universe like a spiritual ghost and never touch a thing. In between the atom and the first shell of the electrons, there's such a vast space. Someone, Willie Ley, once gave the correlation. He said if the atom were the size of a football field, the nucleus would be a pea on the 50-yard line, and the first electron shells would be in the end zones. And they would be like little gnats. So that the atom is largely empty space. In actuality, it's not empty so much as it is also full. So that as soon as there's anything added to the empty fullness, it both is absorbed and emitted instantly. And this is the whole basis of iteration. So one of the interesting things about reality is that it absorbs energy and dynamic, and if there is any excess whatsoever, it reiterates, it re-emits that form again, but with a slight, very slight change. With a change so slight sometimes that it might take trillions of iterations for it to become apparent that it had changed at all. This is a very interesting 21st century way of looking now, and this is why it's called interstellar learning, because we're learning to be real in the entire universe, and we're discovering that not only are there two processes of nature and experience, but there are two other processes that complement them. And the two other processes are consciousness and history. And that whereas nature and experience are integral processes, they like to come together. Consciousness and history are differential processes, and they like to have variety and freedom. Walt Whitman once in Democratic Vistas said, it seems to me that nature favors two things especially. She likes freedom and variation. And out of that, a contemporary of Whitman named Johannes Brahms developed a whole style of musical composition known as developing variation. Whitman and Brahms, very much contemporaries and very interesting. The development of Brahms's music is a good case in point of the way in which it led, like Cézanne's painting, leading to Cubism. Brahms led immediately to the 12-tone explorations of Schoenberg. It's interesting to see that when we have a learning which is open to the entire realm, not just to the scale of what we're familiar with, but it's complement a scale that we're not familiar with. And when we keep that entire arena alive, our sense of learning becomes both spontaneous and memorable. One of the difficulties of the old-fashioned university education is that 5 years after the course, you can not remember even 5% of what you learned. And after 30 years, you can hardly remember anything. Whereas with this learning, the more that you get it, the more there is to get, and the more indelibly, instantly it is there. But not there as baggage and luggage that you have to cart around. It's there anytime you want to avail yourself of using it. And so this is a new scale of being human. This is a new presentation of ourselves and our capacities. While the universe is always integral, the cosmos is both integral and differential. So that there is a difference. Nature likes existence, but consciousness favors presence. And so whenever presence comes into play in existential situations, in ritual situations, it always comes into play as a transformer. A little bit of consciousness will operate as a transformation dimension and change the entire array, all of its possibilities. All of a sudden, instead of just having blue stones that one can pick up naturally from the ground, you can have the vision to polish those blue stones, and you get a piece of turquoise or a piece of lapis lazuli that all of a sudden has a different quality from the mineral ore. It becomes a semi-precious stone. And one learns that you can take a odd-looking piece of rare rock, and you can polish it, and you can make an emerald or a ruby or a diamond. And all of a sudden, the jewel quality of the cosmos comes into play as a differential form. Those differential forms are the forms of art. And so we're looking at the way in which ritual, in between nature and experience, is the first objectivity. But there is a further objectivity in the mind in symbols. But there's like a third objectivity that comes out of art, because art is in between two differential forms, differential processes. It's in between visionary consciousness and history. And as art goes into its registry, it doesn't iterate integrally by itself, but it iterates both integrally and differentially at the same time, so that art forms always have a distinctive complementarity to them. They have a tone of complementarity. That is, they not only transform, but they continuously are transformative. And so a participation with nature will help one get keyed back into nature and appreciate existence. But getting in tune with art brings the tone of consciousness as a transformer into play everywhere. And the rituals become varied. And as they become varied, the sources of experience become wider. Let's take a little break and we'll come back. We're back. We're back and we're looking at fours. We're looking at fours because there is not only a square, which gives us a frame. The British used to call it the big picture. But there are four angles as well. And you can have a square which is like the standard square, or you can have a square which is two lines crossed like a Roman cross, a St. Andrew's cross, is also a square. It has the four quadrants. Or you can have an X in the Navajo symbolism very often. That X is the four directions have openness rather than a plane. You can have a plane, you can have a line, you can have an openness. There are all sorts of ways to do fours. The efficacy of Navajo sand paintings is largely contingent upon the ceremony being done 4 times. And Gladys Reichard, who we've talked about now for a month, was a very special person to go into Navajo land. She had been raised, as we talked about, in rural eastern Pennsylvania among Quakers, so that she was very used to sitting quietly and just being with you, rather than having to ask something or to even initiate conversation. And among the American Indian ethos, one of the most cultivated things is the ability to just be together without saying anything for a long time. I remember very close contacts with my Blackfoot friends, Floyd Running Rabbit and his wife Mavis. Floyd was the great-grandson of the great chief Running Rabbit of the Blackfoot Nation. And to most people in Calgary, Alberta, where I was designing the educational program, he was like Fat Indian, whereas I knew his lineage, I knew his family, and sometimes would spend the whole day and not say anything, just be together. Gladys Reichard could do that. And she went because she had gotten interested in anthropology. It was one of those rare times when women could enter into a field of endeavor, and one found that between 1920 and 1940, more than 24 women got their PhDs in anthropology from Columbia. Because there was an old German man who had come over to the United States to set up investigating North American Indians. His name was Franz Boas. And they used to call him Papa Franz. And he loved having lots of daughters who would then chat with him, and he would say, well, why don't you go and investigate this, investigate that, see about these people. And so he would send out his daughters all over the world, actually, but mostly in North America. His speciality were the Northwest Coast Indians, the Kwakiutl. And it was a curious thing. The Kwakiutl had an area in the Pacific Northwest, and one of the deepest ceremonies there was the potlatch. And the potlatch was giving away everything that you have. And you would think that this is one of the stupidest things, but if everyone gives away everything that they have frequently enough, there's a distribution among the entire people, and there's also no coveting. There's no theft. And the level of animosity goes completely down, so that there is hardly anything other than the sense that the people form a field rather than are a shape of inclusion or exclusion. And it's very important in the Pacific Northwest to be not so clearly at home in a limited shape, because it rains all the time. There are islands everywhere all the time, inlets. The definition of land and water is very mishmash and chaotic, and it would drive you crazy if you had to keep track of all the definition that was geometrical, whereas it's very easy just to be at home in a almost like a fractal landscape and climate. And the potlatch is one of the most intelligent ways to keep this sense that reality is wide open all the time, and you don't have to grasp it, you can share it. When Gladys Reichard got to the Navajo lands, Boas had arranged for her to meet an old medicine man. He was known to most of the whites as Miguelito, but to the Navajos he was known as Red Point. Red Point because his wife's hogan was underneath a distinctive butte that had this red prominence up above many meters above where the hogan was, and so he was called Red Point because that was the way in which his wife's hogan was the center or centered in the landscape pointing up into the heavens. Her name was Maria Antonia, and she was one of the really great Navajo weavers. Also very respected in the Navajo people, and she taught Gladys Reichard how to weave. Without making a big deal out of it, she said, "You've come to learn about us. Why don't you get to know us and not just write a monograph? Not just publish and get a PhD. Live with us, be with us, eat with us, speak with us, learn our language." And she learned. And her Navajo grammar still is in use, done after about 30 years of working on it. So that she could live as a woman in the Navajo way. She never married. And her Quaker background and her friend's Boas contacts and her being accepted into the family of Miguelito as like a sister of Maria Antonia. And finally, in 1936, she wrote this book, Navajo Shepherd and Weaver. It's reprinted by Dover, Weaving a Navajo Blanket. And it's one of the classics in anthropology, still available. She says in here, she learned how to weave, how to do all the things, and she talks about all the aspects of it. And she says at one point, when Red Point paints, he uses the same technique as when he does his sand painting. He had been contacted in 1920 by a man named Huckle. John Huckle owned a big hotel in Santa Fe, and he wanted to decorate it with Navajo sand paintings done in a permanent form. And this had never been done before. Because one of the qualities of a sand painting is that it is used up in the healing ceremony. It is not a work of art, it is a presentation of a medicine. It is a ritual form, and its ritual form is to be calibrating energy into this form so that that form then gives the energy to the patient who sits on the sand painting. It isn't that the sand painting is made and then everyone stands back and says, "Wow, let's franchise it. How do we put it on the net?" The sand painting is made to be used up so that all of its energy that it has condensed in its form goes into the healing process of the patient, who then sits on it. And the transfer of that energy is teased out of the sand painting, teased out of the ritual form by the singing, by the chanting. Gladys Reichard says that we all now have gotten used to using the word chant, and it's as good as any word. The very first anthropological monograph on the Navajo was done by a man named Washington Matthews. It was done in 1887. And he used the term chant because it was very current, because Walt Whitman used the term chant about his primordial American poetry that wasn't like European poetry or Greek poetry or any other poetry, that it was an American barbaric yap that had nevertheless a fluid form that allowed for the energy not only to take form but for the dynamic to continue all the way through it. And so Whitman called his poetry chants, and was very affine to the American Indian form of diction, to the American Indian use of a very complex syntax. Many American Indian languages have more than 3-person declensions. They have sometimes 5-person declension, so that one gets all kinds of filigrees and complications that are not possible to be said in European languages, are not possible to be said in Indo-European languages. That the American Indian languages go back to a primordiality before there was anything like civilization, before there was anything like the stylization of languages, even like ancient Sanskrit or ancient Linear B or ancient Egyptian. There was nothing like Egyptian hieroglyphics until 5,000 years ago, and the American Indians had been in North America 10,000 years, 20,000 years before that. So that American Indian languages are one of the most complex language groups on the planet. There are almost 100 families of language in American Indian languages. And we talked a couple of weeks ago about how Los Angeles is one of the most polyglot lingual areas on the planet. More than 20 families of language were spoken in the Los Angeles area hundreds of years ago. So there was more linguistic diversity in Los Angeles than in all of Europe. It's always been a place of many different kinds of peoples coming and going, and not to have one kind of people here. And so instead of using the term polyglot, it's better to use the term kaleidoscopic. So that the mythic reality of Los Angeles is that it is a kaleidoscope of interpenetrative feeling, images, and the wisdom that comes is not called intelligence. The wisdom of experience is called sentience. It's the refinement of feeling and images in their language presentation so that experience is kaleidoscopic. And actually a kaleidoscopic integral makes it much easier then to translate into a harmonic. This is why the form that translates a kaleidoscope into a harmonic is very often referred to as prismatic. It's a prism. It's a lens. It's like a gravity lens, only it is a lens of conscious differential form that allows for the play of the variety and the freedom in the integral to generate new possibilities in the differential world without end. So when someone like Gladys Reichard went to the Navajo and lived, she would go every summer for years and years and years. And she would learn to weave, she would learn to cook with the women, she would learn just to speak. She gained the confidence of all of the people, and especially of Miguelito. He had been commissioned by John Huckle in 1920 to do 47 medicine man sand paintings that could be translated into big illustrations that were put on the walls of the hotel. And later on, when that hotel was threatened and going to be dismembered. Huckle had already died, and a new patron was found for Miguelito. His name was Roman Hubble. He ran a trading post, Hubble's trading post. And Roman Hubble decided that he wanted to recommission Miguelito to do a number of illustrations, and he didn't have the funds that the Huckle family had, so he had him do in watercolors on boards a number of sand paintings, and that was about the time that Gladys Reichard came and understood that there was a huge ferment going on in the 1930s on the Navajo lands, in fact, throughout all of the Indian lands, in fact, throughout the United States, because the Depression was setting in. And they saw that the European white world was crumbling almost overnight, and that there was no sense in hating or fearing this falsity, this false world, because it was falling apart by its own inadequacy. And so there were many medicine men in the Indian nations, especially in the Navajo, who decided that they would like to bring some of the whites into the tribal ethos. And not just those who physically came, but that they would do some of these illustrations so that they would be able to be shared. And in 1936, Gladys Reichard put out this volume with the wife of one of the great trading post people, Frank Newcomb, sand paintings of the Navajo shooting chant with all the illustrations done by Red Point. Only the hitch was that they could not be done by Red Point for the printing of the book. It was printed in just a few hundred copies. This is copy number 3, signed by both women, Frank Newcomb and Gladys Reichard, 1936. The publisher, J.J. Augustin, had a press both in New York and a press in Hamburg, Germany, which is where Franz Boas was from. So Boas arranged for an old family friend of his to publish these things for his girls, for his special daughters of the Southwest. There's a whole study of them called Hidden Scholars, published by the University of New Mexico Press. Hidden Scholars, Women Anthropologists and the Native American Southwest, because there were dozens of them that earned the confidence of not just the Navajo, but the Pueblo peoples, the Apache, the Cheyenne. All of the tribes began to respect these women who had come. They had not come as conquerors. They had not come as priests. They had not come as people taking economic advantage. They had come as women to participate in their lives. And so they were welcomed. Each of these sand paintings is recreated from memory by Frank Newcomb. She and Gladys were allowed to come to the ceremonies and to see them, but because the sand paintings were used up during the ceremony, the patient sits on them and is sung over them for days on end, sometimes as long as 9 days. And all this time, the sand painting is mushed and smushed, and when it's all over, at the very end, the patient stands, and every last bit of the sand painting still on their clothing or body is whisked off with the eagle feather, and then all of it is swept up and taken away, so that there's nothing left. Because what it was a sponge for an energy frequency that was needed for the health of the person. And when that frequency went into the person, that person absorbed it, what was left was like just a sand. It had no value, it had no meaning. other than its ability to transform the energy via the experience energy of the chanting. And one doesn't receive the chant as like a liturgy, but the phrase has always been that one is sung over. That the chant is sung over, it's like the protective resonances of that language envelop that person with the sand painting so that they become whole. He or she absorbs that energy and then has that energy in them. And it's not as if the medicine man has it and then gives it, but that the medicine man uses the vehicle of the ritual sand painting and the mythic language to invite the healing to come from the gods. They're the ones who come. And they bestow. But that the gods live in nature. And because they live in nature, they're not formed as things, but they are universal as process energies that can achieve form. If they're invited, they will come and they will inhabit that form for a little while. And if one is a part of that form, one receives then that divine aid, that divine help. It's not given by a priest. It's not given by some human agency. It is someone who knows how to make a ritual form that is open to invite natural, divine energies to participate in that form and to bring its wholeness and health, and then are released to go back in their own mode of nature again. And what is residual is that the experience of that person who was ill or maimed or crippled are restored to health and wholeness because their experience now is consonant with the natural divine energies. They have that energy in themselves, and their life has the participation in the dynamic of a reality. One doesn't need a doctrine at all. One doesn't need rules or codes or laws, but to participate in this. It's not a question of belief. It is a practice of action. And the Greek word for it, praktike, means the practice. The ritual form is to be practiced. And the complement to it are symbolic forms that are meant to be thought. And the Greek term for that thought, that thinking, theoria, out of which we get the term theory and practice. Praktike and theoria. But theoria in classical Greek didn't mean thought, it meant contemplation. So that there are contemplative forms in the symbol realm of the mind that can be consonant with ritual forms of the body in practice. So that theory and practice are able to be aligned. And it's when they are aligned that for the very first time, referentiality comes into the world. For the very first time, referentiality can be said of language, and before that, there is no referentiality whatsoever in language. Ritual language is not about anything. It is emergent there and then. It is like an existential flash there and then. And they are not so much words, but that they are notes in a chant. They are tones in a chant. And it is the continuity of that being sung over by that chant that is the experience flowing with nature, and in between those two flows, the ritual action is able to form itself spontaneously from the beginning, so that one isn't restored to health from some crippled condition, but that one is re-emerged pristinely. It's not that you are cured by solving the problem, but that you are re-emerged so that the problem does not occur in the first place. So that ancient medicine is, we have to have Tolkien's word for a happy catastrophe, a eucatastrophe. Ancient medicine is eucatastrophic. It means being brought whole out of the universe again. And this is true of all ancient medicines. In archaic Greek times, one went to sleep in the temple of Asclepius to have a dream. And the dream was the mythic version of the being chanted over. And when one woke back up out of pristine health, not because you were cured of the illness, but that you were re-emerged so that the illness would not occur at all. One was not healed in the sense that you were restored to health, but you were healed because you were reborn whole again. It's a completely different thing. Being treated for symptoms has nothing to do with being cured by primordial emergence. And so when someone like a Gladys Reichard got into the depth, she realized that most of the anthropologists that were in universities didn't understand the people at all. They didn't understand what they were looking at. They didn't even understand themselves. The prize anthropologist on the Navajo, the head of the anthropology department at Harvard, Clyde Cockone, dismissed Gladys Reichard. She's an amateur. She weaves rugs. She talks to them. The hell kind of scholar is this? She's never lectured anywhere in Harvard. And that honest stuck for a long time, not only to Gladys Reichard, but to a lot of the women anthropologists. And we'll see when we start next week with Ruth Benedict, she's the first woman to fight back on a par with the chauvinistic professors, and she beat them at their own game. She blew them out. Because when Patterns of Culture was published, it became an instant bestseller. It was read all over the world in hundreds of thousands of copies. There isn't a professor at Harvard in the 30s whose monograph sold more than a couple hundred copies. She blew them out. But one of the heroines of Gladys Reichard was a woman named Elsie Clews Parsons. C-L-E-W-S. Elsie Clews Parsons. She was very wealthy. She was quite independent. She didn't even get into anthropology until she was in her 40s. And she stumbled onto Franz Boas. And she was amazed that all this stuff was going on. She was writing political, social books and criticisms of the process. And here, all of a sudden, she realized here was a whole group of people who were going outside of and above and beyond all of the social problems that she had been criticizing for 20 years in her books. And so she became one of the really great anthropologists. She was in her 50s before she really began to do a lot of her stuff and publish her books. Her big 2-volume study of Pueblo religion is still the classic in the area, not going to ever be surpassed. But because she was wealthy, she funded a lot of people to study anthropology. She created a couple of chairs for anthropology, but she also created a little secretariatship for Franz Boas. And one of the greatest of all anthropologists was the secretary of Franz Boas named Ruth Bunzel. In 1929, Ruth Bunzel wrote a little monograph called The Pueblo Potter. And it was the first time that anybody had ever understood the complete ritual comportment of American Indian pottery, and that it has nothing whatsoever to do with the academic projective monographs that people had assumed this is what they're about. Because those monographs were all based on shards of civilized people that archaeologically had been found and put together. And American Indian pottery is from the Paleolithic. It's not from shards from any civilization. It is freshly emerged pristinely from the old Paleolithic ethos, just like the Navajo rugs originally. They are primordial in the sense that they come out of the landscape from someone who is a part of the landscape. The illustration here at the frontispiece is the old Indian woman seated under a tree, and her loom are special pieces of wood that are not shaped. Reichard says, it's better not to have shaped pieces for your loom. It's better to have everything wide open and a little raw, because the techniques that are used go back to a Paleolithic wisdom, and they're not dependent on a learned craft polishing. They're meant to work instantly, spontaneously out of nature, because you are there as a part of that nature. And she goes into all the techniques of how what helps bring the rug into form is the border. That the border is not just one line, but it's always a pair of strings. And it's the way in which the hands, the right and the left hand, are able to braid those two strings on the border that allows for the border to inch into the field of the rug, and eventually the entire rug becomes a resonance form of the border technique. And she goes into it. And she says, the value of it as an art object is not about itself. It is not an art object. The value of it as an art object may depend upon the individual who wears it, may have nothing at all to do with its general or original symbolism. In the same way, I think the Navajo have kept the symbolic designs of their religion apart, in a separate compartment of their minds, from their ordinary blanket and silverwork patterns. The form occasionally overlaps, but the emotions are kept distinct. The art is in the person using it as fashion, as an object for their individuality. But the object per se is not an art form, is a ritual form. And ritual in the sense that it is able to absorb natural energy and to convey that into the experience of whoever is the experiencer. So that ritual objects are objective in their sense of conveying the energy of nature into wholesome experience. It's not about aesthetics at all. It has nothing to do with aesthetics. Aesthetics are enormously important, but they are transformative. They come into play only when the mind is capable of being opened up by consciousness. And so our learning, our education, is going back to not just the ABCs, but back to something even more primordial than the vowels. Before our kind of primate could say vowels, we had to have several orders of transformation physiologically. Homo neanderthal couldn't speak like we can speak. They didn't have a refined enough neural system. It's only when you get to Homo sapiens sapiens that you find in the thoracic area of the spinal column that it's expanded and the brain is expanded in certain ways in the cerebellum, so that there is a possibility for something that is indispensable in language, and that is breath control. In order to speak, one has to control one's breath. How fast? You have to have a minimum ability to change breath control more than 60 times a second, or you cannot talk. And our species is the first species that's able physiologically to do that. Our learning is not about educational subjects that get degrees, but about how to become real from the get-go and before. More next week.